Hi, today we'll talk about Elizabethan England and the English Enlightenment. And the theme of this discussion is that English rulers and Parliament struggled for stability during this period through war and revolution. So let's begin with Parliament. Its origins are in 1214 with the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, an agreement between King John and nobles who demanded to share in power. And that's the foundation for two houses, what became two houses, the House of Lords, the House of Commons. House of Lords consists of nobles, archbishops, and bishops, and the House of Commons represented eventually largely commoners from town and country who were usually wealthy landowners. And the trick with the ruler of Britain was then that he or she always had to negotiate with Parliament to get anything done, taxes, policy, and so on. And in this environment, Queen Elizabeth I arrived. She was 25 years old when she asserted rule, one of the first female monarchs in British history to have this degree of power. And she ended up becoming one of the longest serving monarchs in British history at 44 years. She also became exceedingly powerful and influential in British history. She came in with several advantages that perhaps many of her predecessors did not have. One, she was the daughter of King Henry VIII through his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And he was one of the Tudors, from the Tudor dynasty, and the Tudor name certainly still had resonance in England. Second, her immediate predecessor was Mary Tudor, who was her half-sister. This was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary as she was known, was exceedingly unpopular. She tried to reassert Catholicism in the nation and executed scores of individuals who came up against her. So Elizabeth, in that sense, was a bit of a welcome change from Mary Tudor. And a third advantage is that Queen Elizabeth was smart. She was politically flexible when she had to be, but she was also defiant when she was challenged, and she rarely lost. Yet she also faced several substantial challenges to her empire. First of all, she's one of the few examples that we have of early modern Europe of women ruling over a vast empire. Queen Isabella of Spain. We have the Tsarinas, Elizabeth and Catherine the Great of Russia, Queen Christina of Sweden. But Queen Elizabeth I is, in a way, in a different category all to herself. She came into a world, an environment at the English court in which men saw themselves as rational beings who were meant to rule, who were trained in warfare and politics. They tended to view women as irrational, as not capable of ruling, that they were temperamentally and intellectually unfit to be queen or head ruler of a major nation. And so, as a result, they felt that few noble women should at all get involved in political matters. And they viewed women who did do so as dangerous, problematic, and should be repressed. That's the kind of environment that Queen Elizabeth met when she first arrived at court. Another pressure that she had to face, that few of her predecessors had to face, was she was expected to marry. and she was sent numerous suitors from Austria, from France, from Sweden, and from England, and Spain. And her contemporaries expected that she would take one of these suitors, marry, and produce heirs. This was not something that Queen Elizabeth wanted to do, for a simple reason. If she married, she'd have to share power. And in a very troubled and difficult time in English history, she felt, and probably quite rightly, that this could be dangerous politically for the nation. And so she decided to remain single and became known as the Virgin Queen. She also faced many threats, both external and internal. One of these was one of her relatives, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the granddaughter of the sister of King Henry VIII, Margaret. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic. She was in France, came to Scotland, which she had sought to rule, and then came down to England. And she could pose a potential threat to the rule of Elizabeth. So Elizabeth had her captured and imprisoned, but didn't want to execute her. She was afraid of that precedent, even though her court had recommended it. And it's only when much later she discovered a plot with Mary, Queen of Scots, that was meant to usurp or take over Elizabeth's rule. And then she realized she had no choice, and she had her executed. She also, in part for that reason, and in part for others, she did not have very good relations with the series of popes. As we can imagine, the Catholic Church took a very dim view of her father, King Henry VIII, for divorcing Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, and then proceeding effectively to launch a breakaway movement, which became the Anglican Church. So there's that. But the Church also decidedly did not like Elizabeth, the way she asserted her rule, the way she refused these suitors, many of whom were Catholic, and presented a danger. Pius V had her excommunicated, much as the previous Pope, Leo X, had Martin Luther excommunicated. And Pius V said no one had to follow oaths to follow Elizabeth I. And Gregory X, Pope Gregory X, said it would not be a sin to rid the world of a heretic like her, which potentially gave would-be assassins the go-ahead to move in secretly and assassinate her. And as we know, assassinations were exceedingly common in the courts of early modern Europe. And so one of her main challenges was in the area of religion. England was still very much in the flows of conflict over religion, whether to return to Catholicism or to reassert Protestantism, in this case the Anglican Church or the Church of England. And Queen Elizabeth, although she was no fanatic regarding religion, she was willing to compromise on some issues, but she issued one of her first acts as queen was to issue the Act of Supremacy in 1559. And that act reasserted with Parliament Protestantism in England. And that act also helped boost some of her popularity among some, but not all, nobles at the court, because it showed she was willing to take a quite defiant and very public stand on religion, one of the most divisive issues still in England. But keep in mind that England was not universally Protestant. There were many nobles and commoners still in England who remained Catholic. They had to be largely secretly Catholic, but they were Catholic nonetheless. And but there were also Calvinists who were not very popular in England either, because they were constantly preaching. They said the Church of England was evil and corrupt. Right? This is the group that eventually ended up sending pilgrims, as they were called, to the New World. So she had to battle with this group as well, try to find common ground on the issue of religion, and if necessary, to suppress, capture, torture, and execute those who would resist her rule on the issue of religion. And one of her greatest adversaries, by far, was Spain. Spain, as one of the largest empires in the world at that time, the 16th, early 17th centuries, has stretched across much of the globe, especially the Americas, and was therefore a very wealthy empire and a well-armed empire that could potentially invade England. England came this close to being invaded by a very large force. King Philip II, who had been one of the suitors of Queen Elizabeth and was spurned, decided for several reasons, certainly the dangers that Queen Elizabeth presented on numerous fronts, supporting the Dutch Republic, who fought against Spain, reasserting religion and so on. For several reasons, Philip II sent a large portion of his fleet, known as the Spanish Armada, to invade 1588. And in an extraordinary series of events, that massive fleet with 20,000 soldiers eventually came under fire from British guns, were sent into disarray, tried to reassemble and counterattack, and then faced a series of storms, which the English could only view as a sign of God protecting them. And it ended up scuttling over half of the Spanish Armada, and the Spanish lost in that absolute tragedy for Spain. 15,000 soldiers, or most of those who were sent out. This was catastrophic. And for Spain, the kings never again sought to invade England. So that too was a huge booster in morale for England and for Queen Elizabeth, that she showed she could take on one of the greatest empires of the era, and through luck and skill and encouraging troops to maintain their positions, she could win. And these sorts of things began to turn the tide for a perception of nobles at court. One, that she could be an effective ruler, but also that women could rule at court and were not necessarily viewed as irrational beings who were not prepared to rule. Queen Elizabeth presented a very different figure. And I think part of the importance of Queen Elizabeth was precisely her image. She was not a very tall person, 5'5" roughly, and she had flaming red hair. She was beautifully dressed in her gowns with much jewelry, so she presented herself as a remarkable figure at court. She was often at the center of festivities. She supported theater, she supported music and dance and festivals, and this was all part of the trappings of power. And Elizabeth knew how to play that game better than almost any of her predecessors. Indeed, this was the perfect environment for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is an enigma. Despite being one of the most famous playwrights of the English language, we know startlingly little about him. We know he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, that he got a good education at the King's New School. We know that his father first worked with animal skins and then became the mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon. We know that his mother, Mary Arden, came from a fairly well-to-do family. So these things we know. We also know that his father, as mayor, was responsible for entertainment at Stratford, and this may well have been some of the first experiences that young William Shakespeare had with the theater. He married at the age of 18 to Anne Hathaway, and he had 3 children. We also know that his love was really in the theater, that he could not make a go of it in Stratford-upon-Avon, so he goes to the center, cultural center, the intellectual center of England, and that's London. In the center of theater in Britain, in London, this young man arrives at the age of 23, and he begins writing plays. First, he begins with histories. King Henry VI. He proceeds to write at least 37 plays in 25 years. And he also acts regularly in his own plays. He joined an acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. But what we don't know is his likes and dislikes. We know very little of what he thought about religion or politics. One writer said he did not like lawyers. He preferred drinking to eating, and evidently lusted after both genders. And he wasn't just a playwright, he was also a poet. He wrote over 150 sonnets. But we do know quite a bit about the theater of England, the Elizabethan theater, when it reached, in some ways, its peak during this era. Queen Elizabeth was a major patron of the arts, and theater flourished as a means of diversion, entertainment, but also social commentary, and to some extent political commentary as well. Keep in mind that being an actor in Elizabethan England was not a noble profession. The English tended to look down on actors as low-life, as untrustworthy, as debauched. To be a playwright was somewhat better, but it certainly meant an opportunity to share in profits from a theater. And this, we know, William Shakespeare did exceedingly well. He wrote plays that he felt would reach the largest possible audiences, to create dramas, comedies, tragedies that would entice people to the theater and keep them fixed with their eyes on the stage and follow the drama and pay money, and Shakespeare would then benefit from the profits. So he became exceedingly, well, quite wealthy from his theatrical endeavors. Also keeping in mind that all actors were men. Women were not allowed on the stage in England until the later 17th century, long after Shakespeare had died. And a common theme in Shakespeare is cross-dressing, or men playing women, but also men playing women playing men. And so Shakespeare played around a lot with sexual roles, with identities, and also with politics. Think of one of his most favorite of his plays, Hamlet. To be or not to be, a tortured prince from Denmark from the medieval period seemed to personify a figure with whom many could identify, the troubled court that could replicate itself on stages across Europe. And so Shakespeare took on one topic after another. The histories, Henry VI, King John, Richard III. Comedies, he achieved some of his greatest successes. Midsummer Night's Dream, which was probably written as a commission for a noble marriage and performed outdoors, as many Shakespeare's plays were. One writer called it his first undoubted masterwork, without flaw, and one of his dozen or so plays of overwhelming originality and power. All's Well That Ends Well, Much Ado About Nothing. These comedies brought audiences again and again to the theater, the Rose Theater. He also wrote tragedies. We only think of Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and Antony and Cleopatra. The Rose Theater was only about 72 feet in diameter, and in this space came all levels of British society, from the wealthy down to those with virtually no means, who would stand in the center just before the stage. And Shakespeare had to target audiences who would appeal to each one of these levels. So we find very intellectual jokes that only a small portion of the audience might catch, historical references, political references, and we also find a lot of bawdy humor, very sensual in content, that would appeal to other groups in the theater. And so Shakespeare found himself as a master of the medium of the stage. Some scholars have likened Shakespeare to Dante Alighieri, the Italian medieval writer. Whereas Dante excelled in poetry, Shakespeare excelled in plays. But Shakespeare had some assets that Dante did not. Shakespeare was not a moralizer like Dante was, and he combined a technical skill with the ability to put universal human experiences into poetic language. And this is the language of the stage. And perhaps his most amazing gift, as we look at his work, is his understanding of people, of human nature. Another scholar even says that he invented the human, that he put figures on the stage who were not one or two-dimensional, but were three-dimensional, seemed to come alive, were very original and powerful and often striking. And if we think of just a few lines of Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, from Richard III. Or Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo, from Romeo and Juliet. And of course, to be or not to be, that is the question from Hamlet. And Shakespeare, in that sense, personifies a period in British history in which the theater provided a center for social, political identity, cultural patronage, and a means of getting across to a broad audience important themes that people felt spoke directly to them at the time. Now let's turn to war and revolution. One of Elizabeth I's successors was Charles I. Charles I had very little, if any, of the political acumen that Elizabeth did. Indeed, he ended up confronting Parliament, finding himself far more prepared to rule, in his view, and indeed sought to rule without Parliament. Needless to say, the nobility and the English people grew angry at his demand for more taxes, for his building projects, and ultimately decided to get rid of Charles I altogether. And that is the onset of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. It resulted in an extraordinary takeover of power from the English king and placing Charles I on trial for treason and then executing him, regicide. This places the history of the English Parliament in quite a different role compared to other parliaments in Europe. Into that civil war steps Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a general, prided himself as being exceedingly religious, a Calvinist or Presbyterian, as was popular in Scotland, and sought to wipe out any vestige of Catholicism in the country, to reassert parliamentarian rule in Britain, but also to suppress the Church of England, Anglicanism. And so for this brief period, we find the Calvinist Church in England called Presbyterianism, which asserted its place. But more than that, England embarked on an experiment, which was to rule with no king. Here we have almost no precedent that I'm aware of in early modern Europe, where Parliament would take the fore with what became a dictator, Oliver Cromwell, and effectively to try to assert unity across the British Isles, in Scotland, in England, and in Ireland. And Cromwell developed very quickly a reputation for brutality and was long remembered in Ireland for his fierce repression of the Irish people. The result of that is that Parliament eventually overthrew Cromwell and reasserted its rule. Under this environment, the political writer and theorist Thomas Hobbes suggested in his landmark work, Leviathan, that human nature is problematic. It is a desire for self-pleasure or self-preservation. It's a very harsh view of human nature. And that if you can repress the people effectively, you can establish control in the country. And so Leviathan is coming of age during an enormously troubled and difficult time in British history. And his writings on physics, moral philosophy, civil philosophy showed how specific emotions affect the mind: desire, hate, hunger, fear, anger, and envy. We might view this as a rather pessimistic view of human nature, that rational thought held relatively little importance for many of the masses, according to Hobbes. And under this environment, England asserted its major revolution, which in a sense ran somewhat counter to Hobbes' ideology, called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Again, over the fear that a ruler would reassert Catholicism in the nation, Parliament took hold and invited William and Mary from Holland to come over and basically establish themselves as the new king and queen of Britain. Also, in many ways, unprecedented in British history. That kind of selection of two monarchs to achieve specific ends in Britain, to reassert a balance between the monarchy and Parliament, but also to once and for all assert a kind of religious unity, or the Church of England. One striking thing of why it's called the Glorious Revolution is that there was relatively little bloodshed, especially when compared to the Civil War. Little bloodshed in England. There was certainly bloodshed in Ireland and in Scotland. but not so in England. William of Orange and his wife Mary were firmly Protestant. They continually worked with Parliament to choose a council, officers of state, to effectively create a Bill of Rights from 1689 that the American Bill of Rights eventually was based on. And all of these are a direct result of the Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment, but especially the Scottish Enlightenment. And out of this environment comes one of the premier theorists in Britain, which is John Locke. Locke published his second treatise of civil government shortly after the Glorious Revolution. And that work proved to be enormously influential in England, in France, and what became the United States. And he set out to justify the parliamentarian rule of Great Britain, that the state could only be powerful if it joined with all members of society and not simply a select few, which is in many ways a leading Enlightenment thought. Out of this group also came Adam Smith from the Scottish Enlightenment. He was a philosopher and an economist. He studied at Glasgow University in Scotland and became a professor of logic at Glasgow before moving on to philosophy. Adam Smith visited France and spent time with a relatively new group of individuals, economists as they called them, or physiocrats, and returned and over the next 15 to 20 years thought over how can we recreate this economic system that we have, asking some of the same questions that this new group of economists in France were asking. And his result was Wealth of Nations, a very different work than, say, Hobbes's Leviathan. Somewhat similar perhaps to Locke, Smith takes a quite optimistic view of human nature. He says that prices or the marketplace should determine supply and demand, not the government, that people will be more productive if they're allowed a division of labor that sets out specific tasks, and that they have choices to choose the products that they feel are best. This is calling for free exchange of goods in competition, or laissez-faire economics, a French term meaning to leave alone. In other words, this is a very different model than the mercantilist model that then ruled in France and in England and in Spain and most other countries. This is a call for something very different, what became the foundation for the commercial revolution in England. And this then is the perfect environment for support of the arts, for theater, and for music, and a kind of environment in which there is a reassertion of parliamentarian rule, working with the monarch to find some kind of more balanced political tradition than had often existed before.